course, that's a very provocative thing to say. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that INGOs don't do good. They do. But in doing good, they also do harm. And I'll try and explain some of the reasons why. And that's the motivation for this paper. So the first thing to say is that INGOs, we've noticed that INGOs have been very, very slow to acknowledge structural racism and their own neo-colonial attitudes up until very recently. In fact, it was a taboo subject. Talking about power inequalities, racism, structural racism, all of that was very much a taboo subject in our sector up until a few years ago. So INGOs have just been completely blind to that. There's also, and we've noticed that INGOs really haven't understood that in trying to grow their footprint and do more and expand, they've actually suppressed the growth of indigenous civil society. In other words, if you have a look at the strategies of INGOs, almost every single one of them says that they want to do more, grow, and according to them, they want to help more people. And of course, that's very honorable and very laudable to say they want to help more people, they want to have bigger impact. But actually, in doing that, they have suppressed the growth of indigenous civil society because the funding gets taken up by the INGOs and so little of it goes to local organizations. So we've just done a piece of research and we've analyzed across OECD countries how much money that's allocated for civil society actually goes to local organizations. And of all the money, if you collect all the money from OECD countries that's supposed to be aimed at civil society organizations, only 7% of it goes to local organizations and 93% of it goes to INGOs. So they absolutely, INGOs take up far, far too much of the space and the funding. And another problem we've noticed is that INGOs just can't imagine a different role for themselves. Most INGOs still undertake direct implementation in countries. And even where they don't directly implement, they have become grant managers. So they are the conduits for funding. So these two roles are the two roles that INGOs see themselves: the technical experts doing all the work, becoming the self-appointed experts, or they are the self-appointed sort of grant managers. They can't imagine another role for themselves. And that failure of imagination is one of the reasons why the sector is not changing. It's not shifting power to local actors. So that's what we've been looking at. We've been trying to figure out how we can change that. But before I do that, I just want to just remind you of some of the work that has led to this. So a few years ago, and some of you, as John mentioned, some of you may have been here 2 years ago when I presented on this, we embarked on a series of global conversations with local actors from around the world, activists from over 50, 60 countries, where we asked them about what the problems were in the sector. And it was abundantly clear how deeply entrenched structural racism was in the sector, in how INGOs and policymakers and donors really do deny and I suppose limit the kind of agency of local actors. And so over the last 3 years, we've produced a number of reports, and these are the reports in front of you. Time to Decolonize Aid came out 2 years ago. Then we did one focused specifically on peace building last year. And next month, we'll be releasing one on partnerships. What do decolonized and transformed international partnerships look like? The purpose of this is that when me sharing this with you now is that we looked at all of this information and we recognize that there are some common threads which deal with INGOs and the role that they play. And I want to share firstly how structural racism shows up in the sector and how it affects how INGOs operate. So you'll see in front of you now a slide which I encourage you to have a look at the I think there's someone needs to just mute. Sorry. So the slide here is reproduced in our first report, Time to Decolonize Aid. I'm going to just share with you a couple of the dimensions of how structural racism shows up. The first one, as I mentioned to you, is about strategies. INGO strategies currently are predicated on that sense of growth, that they are the self-appointed experts, that they are there to save others, to help others, and actually that there's an implicit assumption there that local communities don't have the resources or the skills or the expertise to do it themselves. And that's how INGOs have grown. INGOs have grown based on this assumption that they are there to fill that gap, to fill that deficit, to provide that expertise when the local communities don't have it. That in itself is a racist kind of proposition. And that's very deeply embedded in the system. Another one that I wanted to share with you was how knowledge is generated. So much of the knowledge that's generated in the sector is produced and consumed by global North Western actors. So think tanks and INGOs producing literature on, it might be on the situation in Uganda or the situation in Sri Lanka, but actually that is produced and consumed by global North actors. That consumption and production of knowledge is very, very exclusive. It's not generated by global South actors. It's not consumed by them. So again, there's this cycle of a very small group of organizations in relation to the whole ecosystem dominating the space in terms of knowledge generation and analysis. And I'm just going to share one other dimension of how this shows up is the organizational structures. And this, I think, a lot of INGOs really struggle with, that so many INGOs set up country offices. And in doing so, what we heard from Global South activists was that these structures in their worst form look like neo-colonial outposts. They are staffed by young, Western educated, white, young members of staff with very little experience of the context. And they are managing staff, local staff who are much more experienced, but because the system has been set up this way, those young, relatively inexperienced staff members tend to run those offices. And those offices sometimes don't engage with local communities. They often implement, and if at the very least, at their most generous, they find implementing partners. So again, there's this replication of a structure that really doesn't invest in local capacities and local assets, but is trying to do the work itself. So we've been gathering all this knowledge over the last 3 years and then trying to figure out, what does this mean for the sector going forward? How can we transform the sector? And so we've asked ourselves, is there a role? Is there even a role for INGOs in the future? And the overwhelming response that we had from activists around the world, as well as from our own partners, is yes, there is a role for INGOs in the future, even if it does need to transform itself. The role will mean, firstly, a smaller INGO sector. We're going to have to, if we're going to shift power and resources to local communities and local organizations, we have to accept that INGOs have to take up a smaller amount, a smaller percentage of the pie, right? A smaller percentage of that funding. We also have to see donors and INGOs giving up power and control. At the moment, far too much of that is concentrated in a handful of global North actors. And there needs to be greater humility amongst global North actors. So there's this end of white saviorism, as some global South actors said to us. You know, we have to be more humble as global North organizations. And we have to find a way of getting donors to provide more direct support to local organizations. We also INGOs need to transition away from direct implementation and start supporting indigenous civil society organizations and local communities directly. And then we're going to have to see an end to country offices, or at least an end to the way in which country offices are currently constituted. So we think the sector is in the midst of a transformation. It might take time, but we hope that this paper will provide some sort of guidance around what that transformation could look like for INGOs. So what does it look like? Well, we identified, and we had a long set of conversations with our own partners about, imagine a time when INGOs are no longer directly implementing, and INGOs aren't even grant managing. What is their role? And we found that there were 9 distinct roles that INGOs could play. And the questions that I've put in these slides are aimed at INGOs, but you can imagine if you're a community-based organization or a local organization, asking your INGO partner these questions. So the first role that an INGO can play is as an interpreter. So we've noticed that, and you will have all seen this, so much of the sector reports are couched in jargon. It's incomprehensible to most people, even those who have been in the sector for many years. And that means that information is not getting accessed by local actors, and they're not able to engage in those conversations. So what can we do? What can INGOs do? They can translate those, not just actually translating those into local languages, but interpreting those reports to say, this is what it means for local actors, to really enable them to engage in those conversations. So if you are a community-based organization or a local organization, I would ask you to ask your INGO partners, could they translate some of the UN SDG reports or donor statements for you? Could they make sure that they are accessible in multiple languages and simplified in ways that then can be shared with communities so that they become part of that conversation? So being an interpreter is a really useful role, and it's one that our partners have shared with us many times. The second role is about being a knowledge broker. So we know that there is so much knowledge residing in the experiences and of organizations and communities around the world. We also know that most local organizations don't have time to access or locate this knowledge. They're busy doing their work, internet connections are poor, they're sometimes living hand to mouth. So actually, what can INGOs do? Well, they can bridge that gap. They can identify where there could be knowledge that could really support their partners in the global south, local organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that that knowledge sits in the global north. It could be knowledge from other contexts around the world, from other community-based organizations. But it's a role as a broker of knowledge that could be really, really useful for local organizations. And of course, INGOs could also start intentionally sharing the knowledge that they produce. Now, you'll see that there's 3 asterisks there, and where you see those 3 little stars is a health warning. And the health warning that we put on this is that sometimes being a knowledge broker is used by INGOs to and misused by INGOs to demonstrate that they have knowledge and expertise and that they are the only ones who have knowledge. And of course, that's not correct. We don't believe that and agree with that. So it needs to be handled with care. But the role that Peace Direct plays with our partners is to really scour the world for useful information and knowledge that our partners could access. So being a knowledge broker is something that we consider we do all the time. So how could an INGO, if you ask your INGO partners, how could they identify knowledge from other global south actors that could be benefiting them? How can they become that knowledge broker? The third one is a trainer and coach. Now, there's a lot that's been discussed around the very problematic framing of capacity building. We hear the term capacity building all the time, and we heard very strong pushback from activists around the world saying, don't continue to use the words capacity building because it suggests that we lack capacity, we lack skills. We have capacity, we have skills, but they also recognize that they want to learn. We all want to learn, we all want to develop. So they weren't denying that there aren't any gaps. They just don't want the conversation to start with an assumption that there's a deficit. So what is it that INGOs can do? Well, they could become a trainer, a coach, and even a co-learner, learning together. So how can they do that? Well, we know that there's lots of problems around due diligence and compliance that lots of local organizations are unfamiliar with and actually quite intimidated by. So there's a role for INGOs there. There are some certain roles around fundraising or marketing or web design, other things that INGOs can provide that those skills may not be in ready supply in certain countries around the world. So there are absolutely roles that the INGO can play as a trainer and a coach. But again, you see there's a health warning there. We've got to tread carefully because INGOs in the past, historically, have oversold their role as technical experts and therefore then use that to justify why they should receive funding to train others. So again, we need to tread carefully here. Importantly here is the idea of co-learning. So how can we as an INGO learn alongside, learn with, rather than teaching over someone? So rather than just a classic teacher-student role, can we learn together? So I would ask you, if you're a community-based organization, ask that question of your INGO partners. Can we be co-learning partners? Don't think of us as the students, think of us as co-learners together. The fourth role is around convener. Now, this is a really interesting one for us because we've been convening for close to 20 years, and we've noticed that opportunities in many global south countries is really limited for collective reflection and learning. So civil society organizations are often starved of the opportunities to meet and reflect and learn together. And we talk about this, about what we call the horizontal and vertical fragmentation within civil society. So in any country, whichever country you're in, you can think about civil society operating horizontally, so community-based organizations in a particular location, not necessarily being able to talk to other community-based organizations because the road network may not be strong, because you may not have a vehicle, because you are very busy doing your own work and you don't have the capacity and time to be able to go and engage with other local organizations. And sometimes also because there's competition, right? And then there's the vertical fragmentation. So how local organizations aren't able to engage with organizations in the capital city. So that kind of the elites often. So there's a fragmentation at that end. So how do local organizations find the time to engage with, particularly if you're not based in the capital city? So that fragmentation exists in almost every country. And that means that there isn't that opportunity to just take time, learn from each other, share experiences without an agenda, without a project plan, just to build those links. So we have noticed that INGOs can play an extremely useful role in creating those spaces, providing an opportunity for organizations in a particular area to come together, to learn from each other. And when that happens, we've noticed that magic happens. Local organizations start sparking off each other, learning from each other, but also coming up with ideas for joint advocacy, joint projects. But just giving that time and space is really, really valuable. So if you are a local organization, I would ask your INGO partners, can they build in opportunities to learn and reflect with other local organizations across your country, or even in other countries? Ask them to do that, because actually that convening is priceless. It's a really fantastic opportunity to build allies everywhere. Linked to the convening role is the connecting and ecosystem building role. So I talked about the fact that civil society is highly fragmented, and how it's fragmented both vertically and horizontally. And what that has meant is that civil society, if you imagine any country as being an ecosystem of actors, small organizations, large organizations, individual activists, all of them forming a rich, diverse ecosystem of civil society actors. They don't often have the opportunity to think of themselves as a movement, or as a network, or as a community itself of actors, because they're so fragmented. So what can INGOs do? Well, they can build the connections. They can act as the connective tissue, really linking actors together. Now, sometimes that can be done through convening, but not always. It could be done through joint projects, facilitating joint projects. It could be through exchanges between organizations. So an INGO could say, okay, why don't one of our partners go and learn from another partner, and making those connections. That connective tissue is something that INGOs can do really well and can really help strengthen the ecosystem. And once you build a strong, resilient ecosystem, then you can start to see impact at scale, and you can start to see some real changes at the policy level as well, because you're speaking with one voice amongst networks of you. And I'm sure the movement for community-led development do that very well, being a sort of ecosystem builder. So the question again for you, asking your INGO partners, is how can the INGOs look at the health of the ecosystem itself, rather than just looking at project inputs and outputs and activities? Think about the health of the ecosystem and how that can be strengthened. The sixth is a very well established role for INGOs, and this is one where people in this current time that we're living in terms of reimagining the role of the INGO, really looking at the sector differently. I think INGOs are worried about their power, and quite rightly so, because they have taken up, they have such a powerful role in the sector right now, and that is a problem. So INGOs are nervous, I think, about leaning into their power. Having said that, they can use their power wisely. So they can use that for traditional advocacy, really thinking about how they can advocate for their partners, provide spaces for their partners to engage directly with policymakers, campaign. All of those things are really useful roles that we can play to raise awareness about the situation that our partners face. And of course, that includes, really critically, educating the public in our own country about the need for greater solidarity with communities and local organisations. So at Peace Direct, based in London, we see it as a responsibility to educate the British public about what solidarity means and what it means to really support local efforts. So even if you're not an advocacy organisation as an INGO, you should be asking, if you're a community-based organisation, ask your INGO partners, how can they be a better advocate for you? How can they do that in spaces that you aren't able to go to? And how can they make space for you to join those places? So at the UN or in the EU or the AU, places where you can start to speak about what matters to you. The seventh role is around being a watchdog. Again, quite a well-established role, I think, still highly valued by CSOs in the Global South from what we hear. It's, how we know that the civil society space and civic space is shrinking. For those of you who have looked at the latest State of Civil Society report by Civicus, we see even more restrictions on civil society around the world. And I really would encourage you to have a look at that, because it gives you a global picture of just how difficult it is for civil society organizations. So what can we do as INGOs? We can be a watchdog. We can say the things that others can't say, because of course, for you to say it, if you are a local organization, could put you at risk. So we can use our power to be a watchdog. In the same way as you hear from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, to really hold governments to account, to make sure that they are opening up spaces and not clamping down on civil society. But they don't, INGOs don't have to do that in the same way as Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or Civicus do. They can do it discreetly as well. So even if INGOs don't see themselves as watchdogs, you can ask them to be your watchdog, to actually raise those issues discreetly with governments, so that you can still continue to exercise the freedoms that you have a right to exercise in your own country. So the eighth role is around being a critical friend. And this is a really interesting for us and very neglected role. And it's neglected because so much of the work that happens in the sector now is projectized. It's about inputs, outputs, activities. It's about grant management. It's about due diligence, compliance, and risk aversion. And it's not about just accompaniment. It's not about solidarity. It's not about walking together as partners. And being a critical friend as an INGO means being that sounding board for your partner, offering advice when asked, and offering support when mistakes are made. And it really is a different role for the INGOs, because most INGOs still consider themselves those self-appointed experts. And so it's really trying to change that and say, you know what, you can be a critical friend. Just think about that role differently to the way in which you have considered your role in the past. So you should ask your INGO partners, are they real critical friends, or do they see themselves purely as grant managers or implementers? And the final role, I would argue, is the most important. We call it the sidekick, and that was inspired by a manifesto that was produced called the Sidekick Manifesto, which you'll see online. At Peace Direct, we've considered ourselves the support team. So we consider ourselves not the experts, we consider our partners the experts, and that our job is to be the support team in whatever they need. And so being a sidekick is really about it's a state of mind. And that state of mind is a really radical shift for INGOs. It's to say, we are no longer in the driving seat. We shouldn't have been in the driving seat for many, many years. And actually, we are the passengers, and this local civil society is in the driving seat. And we are here we're here for the ride, and we're here to help, and we're here to be a sidekick, to support you in whatever you need. Now, That is a fundamental challenge to most INGOs because almost no INGOs are accustomed to being a sidekick. So I think this is a really interesting advocacy opportunity for you as community-based organizations and local organizations to talk to your INGO partners about how they can transition to becoming a sidekick. So those are the 9 roles. But the final thing I wanted to say was the last health warning. Most of the roles that I've described are roles that Peace Direct plays, and we've learned over the last 20 years that are valued by our partners. But most of those roles should be temporary. They are designed to plug holes in a system that doesn't work. If the system works properly, some of those roles should not be necessary. So, for example, the knowledge broker, the convener, or the trainer, they shouldn't be necessary because actually the investment and the resources should go to local organizations. So we don't see in the future, in 10 years, for example, that the INGO needs to be playing all those roles. They might want to play all those roles in the transition phase, but in the future, some of these roles shouldn't be necessary if the system really starts investing and giving the space and the agency to local organizations. But there are still really important roles that we INGOs can play, whether it's as an advocate, a watchdog, a critical friend, and a sidekick. And I would encourage you all to think about how you can have conversations with your INGO partners to help them think about how they might transition into different roles. Because right now, the sector is very stuck, and it's all of our responsibility, I think, to help advance a different type of a conversation, a different type of sector that we all aspire to. Thank you.
Let me unmute. Thank you, Dylan. And thank you, Anne, for being such a gracious welcomer in the chat room to all the people who've kept joining. I think we're bumping up against a record number of participants this month. And I'd just like to see, Dylan, do you have a time to respond to a few questions from people?
Sure. Yes. I mean, I've got another half an hour. I can stay with you for.
Great. So if you can find the little under the 3 dots, how to raise your hand. Oh, there's one. Barry, over to you.
Dylan, I just want to say thank you. That was that was one of the best and clearest articulations of issues I've been struggling with for a long time. And as somebody who has worked for Oxfam and tried to raise some of these issues even a number of years ago, I couldn't have ever articulated them nearly as well as you have. My question is, you know, how do you at Peace Direct think about how to start this kind of transition in thinking and orientation within INGOs that, I mean, I think you have so clearly laid out what I have seen. How do you, I tried to start that conversation. I'm not trying to say I was a hero trying to do it, but, and it's very difficult, as you know. So I would just love to hear any initial thoughts about how do you start that kind of conversation?
Great, Barry.
Great.
Dylan?
Shall we take a couple at a time?
Okay, perfect. Rebecca Giannotti.
Hi, thanks so much, Dylan. That was an amazing presentation. I'd love to know your thoughts about how what you presented and think about the future role of INGOs is similar or different from the current conversation about localization within the INGO and bilateral donor sector, and including USAID. I know we hear a lot about USAID, but they're such a big player in this space. USAID's goals of localization.
Great, Rebecca. And the third one, Evans?
Thank you very much for this meeting, and particularly for this presentation. It was so clear, as the previous speaker had said. There is a huge challenge from INGOs who supposed to be partners with NGOs or CBOs in the global south. And in this case, I'm really referring to my context in Tanzania. And as I said in one of my posts, chat post, I wish we had more partners, INGOs in a number of countries actually participating here so that they can actually know what they need to do. I've been having a lot of issues, and I don't know whether this is the right time to actually do this, but I would just like, in brief, I would just like to know how some of the organizations, and Dylan, if you have some thoughts on how a local organization which has been incubated by an international organization is actually being treated more like a department, an implementation department of this INGO. And because there is no funding from another organization, then you find yourself being swayed from, one project activity to another project activity. And how do you deal with this? How do you actually approach such a situation to be able to let the other party who gives you money to realize that, hey, this is an establishment that needs also to run on its own, which has been incubated by your funding or seed fund. So please, I don't know whether I'm making any sense, but I'm actually facing this situation right now because I was involved in establishing an organization working with artisanal small-scale miners and their communities. And we have had only one donor for the past 3 years. And this comes as a result of coronavirus and all that stuff. So everything has shifted. So we are at a point now where we are thinking, how do we deal with this? So I'd like some ideas on how to deal with the situation. Thank you so much.
Okay, so that's 3, and Maya and Edward are still here, but let's address those 3 and then we'll come back to you too. Dylan?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, John. Those are great questions, and I really appreciate this wonderful kind of engagement on this subject. So Barry mentioned how do you start this conversation? We've spent the last 3 years trying to answer that question. It's very hard because I think that INGOs have not been challenged about their purpose. They have, I think most INGOs have forgotten that they were supposed to do themselves out of a job. They were supposed to set up only as a temporary fix to and then enable local civil society to flourish. And we've forgotten our way, we've lost our way. And so what we found is it's extremely hard for INGOs to come to terms with the fact that they need to transition, they need to shift. That doesn't mean closing down, and it doesn't mean disappearing overnight, but it does mean transitioning. And the way that we've been having the conversations is to first expose them to the ideas of how flawed the system is. And the way we've done that is really just by allowing us as a platform for local organizations to share how they experience the dysfunctions in the system. So we've been sharing the findings from our global consultations. We've spoken to over 500 local activists around the world who have told us the same things about how they feel like second-class citizens in their own countries because of the dominance of INGOs, how that they internalize some of this because they see that success, so-called success that INGOs have, and they then replicate some of these problematic attitudes themselves. So we start to talk about this, and you can see within INGOs, the penny starts to drop, the light bulb starts to switch on, that they realize that there's a problem. And what's been fascinating for us is that we are probably speaking to 2 or 3 NGOs or INGOs every week for the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm going to very briefly just show one slide, if that's okay. and I'll just show you very, very quickly what this looks like. This is the slide that I share with folks. When people talk to me about, you know, how they can change, I first say, look, you first have to look at your worldviews. You have to look at your values. You have to acknowledge that there's a problem. If INGOs don't recognize that there's a problem, they're not going to change. And so we start with the basics. We say, you've got to acknowledge that there's, you know, we have neo-colonial attitudes, that we've always seen ourselves as the self-appointed experts in other people's lives. Why is that? And we've always thought of ourselves as the professionals. Well, why is that? Whose expertise counts? So we talk to them about their worldviews and norms and values, and that is really challenging, but that's where you have to start. If you start with a sort of focus on practice, which is what lots of the localization is focusing on, you know, funding differently or, you know, creating different mechanisms, that isn't going to change your worldview. So you've got to start with that. Then you've got to change your knowledge and attitudes. And if you do that, your knowledge about whose knowledge matters, reflecting on your own power and your own identity, and then thinking about reimagining the sector. Then if you can change your knowledge and attitudes, then you can move to practice quite quickly and start to see some changes. So I do think that we are starting to see changes. As I say, we are accompanying a number of INGOs on a journey already, and we're continuing to have those conversations because actually we're hearing INGOs want to change. And of course, they all came into the sector because they wanted to do good. They wanted to help. So, and we've got to remember that they wanted to do a good thing. And so they feel this is, you know, hard for them to digest, but they want to go on this journey, and it is taking time. So that's how we start. Start with the basics, start with your worldviews and your attitudes, then move to the practice. Rebecca,
can I just say thanks? That was very helpful, and I would love to continue. I'll try to contact you sometime.
Sure.
Thank you.
With Rebecca, you said, is this similar or different to localization? The conversations that we've had with activists around the world, they're pretty underwhelmed by localization. In fact, most of them are fed up with the term localization. Localization, for most local actors, say it's an imported term. We didn't come up with it. You came up with it. You know, humanitarians came up with it because they were doing so much implementing. They wanted to convert something that was external into something that is so-called local. That's not real, genuine, locally led. That's just it's not quite marketing, but it's certainly not deep structural change. And at its very worst, we've seen some INGOs start to talk about localization and they are committed to it because they have a country office. So ironically, we are seeing some INGOs setting up country offices because they believe that that helps advance localization. In other words, they will then start in new countries with their own country offices, with their own staff, rather than investing in what's already there. So we are not fans of the localization agenda. We don't use the word, and we've been told time and time again that it's not a word that local partners like using. They want to see meaningful transformation. Now, of course, there are some people who might be using localization to mean something deep and transformative, but most are seeing it as a technical exercise about getting a little bit more funding to local organizations, but not changing the underlying structures and systems of power, which really need to change. And Evans, you said, how can a local organization navigate the space that it's in if it's being treated as a department of an INGO? Obviously, that's a very particular example you're giving there. I think what I could offer is there's a piece of work that Peace Direct and a number of organizations are doing right now called Stopping as Success, SAS, Stopping as Success. And this started with a research program that we ran for 3 years, which was a research program that said, how can INGOs transition out of their role? And how can they do that in a responsible way? And we gathered case studies from around the world of how INGOs have done that, have transitioned responsibly. And the second phase of the research, so we did the research and we produced a book, and I'll share the links in the chat. We produced a book showing the case studies of how it actually can work. We are now in a second phase, which is accompanying INGOs to help them think through how they can step back from their direct implementing role and become a more responsible partner and have a responsible transition. And what it sounds like here is that the relationship is not working the way it should do. As you say, that you're being treated as the department of an INGO, but also the INGO probably hasn't considered how it should transition. So there's a wealth of information that already exists out there, and we can share that with you. I'd also encourage you all to keep a lookout. Next month, we're releasing our report on partnership. And that really is about how partnerships between global North organizations and global South organizations can be different and better. And we've, again, consulted widely with activists around the world, and they've helped us really inspire us with their ideas. And we've put that all into a report, which we're finalizing now. And I think that can help too, because again, that can be used as an advocacy tool to your INGO partners to say, this is what, partnerships could look like if they're based on these qualities and these values. But at the moment that, most partnerships are really transactional. And that's what you're hearing is they're based on a sort of implementing subcontractor relationship. And no local organization wants to be like that. They want meaningful partnerships. And so we hope that in the next, with the next report, we will be able to share those insights with you, and that could be used to engage with your partner.
Great, thank you, Dylan. So we've got a very small amount of time left on this portion. So if Maya and Edward and the CEPI office could formulate a question that's like 30 seconds long, and then Dylan will have time for a 30-second answer. This will be a lightning round. And then Nelly and Dadiri, I don't know that we'll be able to get to you right now, but if you put things in the chat, we can follow up. So Maya, you were first. Your voice isn't coming through, Maya.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Just wanted to say thank you so much, Dylan, echoing what everyone else has already said. Very inspiring presentation. I read your report a few months ago, close to when it came out, and similarly, it's come up in conversation with a few folks as well, and has been similarly appreciated. The question I have is more about, I guess, the methodology or the process. I'm really someone who thinks in terms of that, and I think sometimes when we have discussions about these sorts of topics, the criticism always comes up. It's like, who is this actually coming from, right? Who is kind of in charge of leading the narrative? You did mention consulting with 500 activists from countries all over the world, which sounds fantastic. I would love to learn more about this consultation process and how it takes place. And it sounds like, you're producing a series of reports on various topics, which are very important. And again, they're very much resonating. Would love to know more about that process. Thank you.
Great, Maya, thank you. And so Edward?
Hi, everyone.
Yes, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I just mine is more of a contribution towards the presentation that was made, how we are able as Sierra Leone as a country, and then a coordinating body for all the NGOs in Sierra Leone for us to be able to achieve exactly what's the efficiency of national NGOs being in full partnership with the international NGOs, being the full implementers in the local communities, and then the international NGOs carrying out an oversight function in terms of capacity building of the national NGOs, and also when it reaches the time of folding that particular project, the national NGOs taking the full ownership of that particular project. How Sierra Leone was able to reach that particular peak, we were able to lobby with the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development, which is the government body, because they deal with the policy that regulates the operations of all NGOs in Sierra Leone. And by so doing, we were able to factor in that particular document how that particular aspect should be effective in Sierra Leone. And for us now, it is very much impactful in the lives of the national NGOs. So you can see most of the international NGOs who are registered in Sierra Leone give money to the national NGOs for them to carry out the implementation. it is because of the policy we are able to influence that policy and lobby through that ministry for us to have it effective. And that is the way we'll be able to succeed in that particular angle, for members to learn exactly how we'll be able to reach here.
Great, Edward, thank you. Now, we're going over your 30-second time for these questions. Rebecca, did you have a question for Dylan? You're muted. Go ahead.
Continue.
Okay, go ahead,
Okay.
team.
Yeah, but most of the time, if these international NGOs get around to employ the local NGOs, they mostly bring entirely their programs. They hardly want to localize the programs. I think working in partnership with the local NGOs to bring it, because if they decide to localize the people, I think it's not that local again. So the transfer of knowledge should be more of the technical. Then the local partners already have that local knowledge, that peculiarity, the dynamics in those particular locality to help the NGO, international NGOs in making it much better. So if the international NGOs are taking the whole things, everything, then the community-based things we are doing will not really come to life as much as we want. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, Dylan, I think you have like 1 minute left before you have to go to your next meeting. What do you have to say to these 3 questions?
Well, thank you. I think for the last 2 questions, I think what I heard was an example of how, you know, local organizations and national organizations can stand up and assert their role, because I think that the sector has been so dominated by INGOs that you know, local organizations sometimes don't feel that they have the power. And actually, I think they have the power. They should use that, and they should find their allies. And I think there's a question in the chat about advocacy. I think that the movement for community-led development and others should also be used to be able to advocate as a group, because it's going to be hard to see those transformations without that. So I would encourage you all to think about finding your allies to advocate together. The colleague from Nigeria who talked about localizing, I mean, the reality is, as you say, is that in most places, it isn't authentic. Localization has become a trendy buzzword to mean maybe hiring some local staff, but not really investing in local community-based organizations and local organizations to do what they want to do. So we've got to be very careful not to jump on the localization bandwagon and start using the term when actually I think the term is open to a lot of abuse right now and a misuse of the term. And to Maya's comment about methodology, I'm happy to send you some information on that offline, but we have an online discussion platform. We open it up to any activist around the world to join us. And we tend to have about 350 people sign up, and then of that, around 150 actually take part over 3 days, 2 to 3 days. And so it's an online discussion platform, which is then supplemented and complemented with focus group discussions and one-to-one interviews. So we try and do a large kind of open forum where people can just discuss the issues based on the agenda, as well as some deeper dives with focus group discussions and one-to-ones. And all of that is then pulled together for these reports. So the last report that we've just produced, which is coming out, that had about 170 participants from around the world. Of course, that's not, you know, a true representative sample, but it is, I think, good enough to be able to demonstrate that there's commonality in experiences across different contexts. We know that there are weaknesses in any of these sort of methodologies. And of course, it would be lovely to have people around the room physically, but that's just too expensive. So this is the next best alternative. But we do get some fantastic insights from these consultations. And our job really, again, is just to be a platform for that. So you'll see their names and their views represented in the reports, not ours. It's really just trying to lift up their voices.
Fabulous, Dylan. Listen, thank you, everyone. I know we could take another 2 or 3 hours on this. But Dylan, particularly thank you for mentioning that platform, because that's a huge opportunity for this conversation to continue. So with that, I was trying to look how to send little applause things, but we can. Thank you, Dylan. It was really great having you back with us. And
thank you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there are clappy things. Anne found the clappy things. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so next speaker is our colleague Pascal, who is going to talk to us about having an annual report, a way to amplify the voice of community-based organizations. So Pascal, let me know when you want your slides to show.
So John, I'll do a brief introduction before referring to my slides.
Okay, great. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to you all. And I'll be presenting on this annual report on behalf of all the MCLD Benin chapter members who are playing a key role in moving our chapter forward. The report emphasizes on several achievements, including the uptake of the participatory CLD assessment tool, the growth mindset campaign, the food system work, including promotion of traditional superfood and support to smart and sustainable agriculture, partnership development with embassies, universities, government ministries, private sector, and many other, including civil society, particularly the involvement in climate change activities and the protection of vital marine ecosystem. I will mention at the regional level the support to the launch of a new association in Central African Republic, the Benin partnership with Togo, and particularly with the youth platform, the ongoing collaboration with national association in West Africa, Nigeria, Liberia, and so on. I'm not exhaustive. Yet the purpose of my presentation is not to focus in deep on those activities or achievements. It is really to share how we have developed the report, taking advantage of the MCLD 2022-2026 umbrella strategy, and then what we have learned from that report for our chapter. So first slide, please, John.
Okay, let's get it up there.
Yes, the presentation is just there. We are sharing just a picture of one of our activities focusing on the food system transformation. So I'll be mentioning what have been implemented in Benin and for the West Africa regional facilitation. This second slide, please, John. When we look at the slides, we look at, in general, the movement phases as we learn it. The first one is the mobilization phases. How do we make sure that we gather people and we share the vision with them and they adopt the vision and really come to collaborate around the vision? The second is the concentration phase, how we get developed, we develop ourselves. We build our muscles to move forward. And the third aspect is the momentum aspect, where we make sure that we have capability to implement action, not only as civil society organization or movements, but making sure that other partners are involved as well at the governmental level and at the community level, I say. But when we come to our MCLD 2022-2026 umbrella strategy, we have a content for each step, each phases. First one, when we talk about mobilization, really about how do we care about establishing a strong association network? How many people are really mobilized? How many stakeholders are mobilized? How do we make sure that all types of stakeholders are there? Government, universities, civil society organization, private sector. How are we mobilize ourselves? Do we find relevant to create thematic groups? How the gender balance is there? How youth are mobilized, and so on and so on. The second aspect is about the resource mobilization. That is about the preparedness and readiness for relevant action. What are the tools we have? How do we disseminate those tools to get prepared for action? And then the third aspect is our capability and to take action for transformative change. As I mentioned, we need really to target the two level, the community level, and how do we act to make sure that decentralization is a reality and resource devolution is also reality there. In the coming slide, we'll see how do we reflect on this, on those points. When we talk about strong chapter, it's really about membership. How do we target platforms? How do we target local platforms? How do we local governance platform as well to make sure that we have a sound association? As I talk about the structure of the platform of the association, as I mentioned before, gender balance is very important and youth are welcome. And yeah. The second slide, the next slide, please. Here we talk about resource mobilization. Here I mentioned the support we have from the movement for community development global secretariat to our national chapters. Particularly, I mentioned here Benin.
That's true.
We have
so why all
the participatory the assessment tool. Those are supported from the global secretariat of the movement. The network weaving material, those are available. The local resource mobilization material who are available. The community-led development worldview of system change with the 10 recommendations. Those are material available from the movement, global secretariat. But at our level, when we talk about resource mobilization, we know that the chapter members are key and we need really to train them. So I just mentioned here the training on the participatory CLD assessment. So as an example of how do we build our skills internally to get prepared for relevant action at a wider level. Could we move to the next slide? Talking about the capability and action taken for transformative change related to sustainable development goals in general, we reflected here on partnership development, including resource mobilization, not only as local as we think about it. These include also mutualization and solidarity. That is one aspect mentioned in the early presentation. I love that very much. And we talk here about cost sharing among civil society, a society organization. We talk also about dissemination of the CLD characteristic, principle, process, and practice through various tools and frame to really a broader audience. We talk also about community of practice to support the implementation of the CLD tools, frames, and make sure that we learn from our chapter members and we co-define really prioritize thematic area and we see how those tools apply to them. Particularly here last year in the report, the tools apply to full system transformation, but the overall frame could be considered by the chapter member, considering youth mobilization and so on and so on. Next slide, please. The lesson we learned, lesson from practice and practices that our MCLD chapter will continue to build on. We find that the umbrella strategy was very helpful, relevant, and suitable for the rank of activities that our chapter could plan and implement. The second, about the leadership, we make sure that all leadership is gender balanced and we have youth, women, association on board, and we especially encourage platform to join. We have the youth platform, youth and women platform, including 22 associations. We have PASSIV, we have the House of Civil Society Organization, and so on. Follow it, the second, the step can, yeah, this next slide. What we have learned is also by the community of practice, we are learning and we are sharing through the visit to our chapter members. That is to say, we make sure that every group have a place at the table. And we really learn a lot through the visit to our chapter members. I will mention again solidarity and mutualization of the resources. We have some activities planned and we only contribute few, and other association, other organization come with their own resources as well. The MCLD presentation to various stakeholders, including civil society organization, ministries, local governments, universities, and research institutes. Let me mention that in top of those presentations, when we'll be meeting with stakeholders, partners, for this year, we have our report. We could use it, saying, this is what we have achieved, and we would really like to move forward with your support in terms of sharing your knowledge, experience, supporting in any resources available at your level. Not only writing proposal, but that way we mobilize people and make sure that they could be really involved in our activities. And it's already worked with 2 or 3 civil society last year. Next slide, please. And one thing I will mention related to the previous is really we open, through doing this, we open a space for co-creation. Principle which is key for our MCLD. Visiting them, learning from them, learning, sharing our tools. Those are opening space for co-creation. What do we plan for what? Here we mentioned 2 things that we have planned for what? Workshop for the dissemination of the report and for capturing the feedback from the chapter members. This is planned for next month, 8th June, we'll be doing that activity. We'll be planning from what we have learned from the report and what has been the thought of the chapter members to have a consolidated plan for 2023, taking inspiration for the report with the involvement of the chapter members. Next slide, please. What do we plan forward? The report will bring input to the Benin chapter book under developments. We have already drafts. We will be refining it from the input we have from the report. And one thing I would really to mention is learning from the PASIB, which is one of the civil society platform affiliated to our MCLD chapter, how to extend the experience on political dialogue and accountability. They have experience on this. We know that we'll be sharing this among our chapter and see who will be willing to join doing political dialogue and accountability. We know that this is a very powerful action to leverage what we have been doing at the community level and to make sure that the government is really involved. Please, next slide, John. Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you, Pascal. So it's, I just, Anne, if I could call on you for a moment to just speak a little, provide some context around this, particularly the umbrella strategy, because I don't think everybody on the call knows about how the chapters have been co-created this umbrella strategy and how this fits.
Sure. Sorry, my camera's not working that well because it's a little funny. But anyway, each national association is self-governed, self-directed, and completely self-determinant, which is aligned with the values and principles of community-led development, of course. And then echoing what Dylan said earlier with regards to what cross-cutting support international entities like the Movement Secretariat can provide, it's the connecting, the convening, and the shared learning. So we co-created our umbrella strategy, which means it's an umbrella across all of our national associations, by listening and talking with the national associations about what kind of technical support and other kinds of support did they need. So it was co-created and reflective of what they need and want, unlike, you know, when an INGO shows up and says, we're going to give you this training and human resources manual, whether you like it or not. So it has 3 buckets, we call it. The first bucket is building a strong network. And we've learned a lot about how to do that through the experience of the Benin chapter, Nigeria chapter, Sierra Leone, many chapters, Uganda. We're learning by doing together, and we're trying to capture the knowledge as it goes along. So one example there is we worked with the network weaving group last year on that. The second bucket is resource mobilization. We've been focusing a lot on domestic resource mobilization, and also the idea that there's a lot more resources besides financial resources, including human resources and the resources of the collective. For example, a collective that has diversity in it, that's a resource that that can be leveraged. Or I heard another one the other day. How about this for a collective resource? Collective intuition. There's so many ways that coming together collectively and creating this strong group can achieve a lot of things, even without a lot of resources sometimes. Although we totally recognize that everybody needs resources and they should get a lot more resources than they currently get now, financial resources. And then the third bucket is capable and taking action for transformation. And as you can see, the Benin chapter has created its priorities in a gender-focused, youth-involved, inclusive way. And then they are working forward on their priorities, including food systems transformation. And so in that case, capable and taking action for food systems transformation, where they have co-created a way forward, how to do that best in Benin, in the context of Benin. But then also a lot of national associations have been learning from their work in this through the work of the umbrella strategy. So I will stop there, but thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, great. I really appreciate that, Anne. Okay, then, so we just have a couple minutes left on this call. I really, really appreciate, particularly that people have, that people have reached out to more people. And I think that's very exciting. I encourage you to do that. Reach out to more people, have them subscribe to the newsletter list so they know when there's calls coming up, and particularly some of these unlearning labs that are going to cover special issues that are coming up. I also really, a lot of what Pascal was referring to, and Dylan also, is really about systems change, of really having a new mindset before you start tinkering with the practices. I did want to share just a couple of updates on our whole co-creation process for the future of the movement as a global whole. So I'm going to share a couple more slides. Okay, you probably recognize this slide. It's kind of been the emblem of our co-creation process. So many of you have participated in calls and meetings and listening cafes that have come up with our new future. I wanted to mention a couple of interesting things that are occurring in it. The first is that, as you've heard, the bilateral funders of this world are all looking at funding civil society, local civil society, and how to do that. And the movement is trying to help them do that, because it's, as you heard from Dylan, it can be complex, and it can either be something that's truly transformative, or it could be something that's just neo-colonial. So they've put out a toolkit. We'll include the link to it if you want to study it. And also, we and a group of civil society groups from different countries and different regions of INGOs have been coming together to discuss this with the bilaterals. And so that was our first step, to really try to collectively get the bilateral funders to actually share what they're doing with each other and with us. So that was our first step. And our second step will be to bring in some of the majority world, Global South national networks, to actually bring their voice into this conversation. So that's one of these, as Dylan mentioned, these advocacy projects to try to amplify people's voice on this. And then I wanted to show you what our kind of global governance structure is going to look at. So as you heard from not only Pascal, from a lot of people, there are national memberships, hundreds and hundreds, many of the national associations have lots and lots of members, and a growing number of community-based organizations, as well as INGOs operating in their country. They elect national boards. And so whether it's Benin, which isn't legally registered yet, or Sierra Leone, which is, the membership elects a board to take fiduciary responsibility of the work of the National Association. They are, when we say the secretariat, that's not like people in the minority world here, like here in Washington. It includes us, but it also includes full-time staff based in Africa, and hopefully soon also in Latin America and Asia. And they're deputed from those national associations to provide these shared services that national associations ask for. So this is kind of the, as Dylan was calling, the sidekick team here. And then there will be a global assembly for global decisions. So each country will select, and this is probably early in 2024, 2 representatives of their country with age and gender diversity to make these global decisions in a democratic way. And that global assembly isn't a fund dispersing body. It's not even a legal entity. It's truly a democratic decision-making process that will be set up. And each of the national associations will have 2 people in those, and they will meet whenever they think it's necessary to welcome new national associations, or if we have a rogue, bad acting, evil, corrupt national association, they'll have the power to kick them out. But that we hope will never, ever, ever happen. But that's when global decision making need to be done. And as you heard from Pascal, most decisions are at the community level or at the national level, and then a few at the global assembly level. So that's the structure. That's my wife trying to phone me. I just wanted you to know that that's emerging, and you'll hear more about it. So we're now at the end of our time. I see Gunjan has just joined us. Anything you want to add, Gunjan, before we all say goodbye?
No, just thank you everyone for being here, and Pascal for a wonderful presentation. We will have more information on the next series in the Unlearning Labs, which we launched yesterday, which will be circulated next week. So we have launched the Unlearning Labs on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which is a space for all of us to come together and see how can we change the way monitoring and evaluation is done globally, and the conversation around monitoring and evaluation. So please join us for that, and let us know if you would be willing to co-create it, because we are co-creating. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, we hit a new record. We peaked at 94 participants in one of our global calls. I think that's a record, so congratulations, and keep on sharing this out to more people. It's been great being with you, and if you want to now unmute and say goodbye to everybody, unmute and say goodbye to everybody. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
All right, bye. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Great session.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for the presentations.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Very much grateful. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank